Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm very proud to represent the Center for Jazz Studies here at Columbia University, and very happy to be here. I'm Bob O'Mealy, director of our center, and happy that we all made it through the freezing rain earlier and the changing weather through the day. You're definitely in the right place at the right time, though. We have a fantastic, just the rehearsal alone has got people jumping around the room here, so you're in a great place. At the center, we're very grateful to the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, our primary funders, and it's important to say that Columbia University requires every student to study jazz in its music survey course. It's very important to realize that. And part of what this means is that we want every student who comes through our programs to be poised for improvisation. We want them to be ready to face the low-down dirtiness of the blues, which are coming, which are on us. And we want them to have what might be called the planetary perspective that goes with the music, too. And that brings us to our emphasis tonight. As important as Louis Armstrong is to the music, and people like to say, no Louis, no us, you might say no Miles, no us, and on and on. But it's also true that no Cuba, no us. It's so important to recognize that. And tonight we celebrate that connection without a trace of nostalgia, but instead with the excitement of a contemporary composer's work and voice. We recognize that jazz is a cousin to many other musics. It's an overlapping collage music that has linkages all over the place, particularly within the African diaspora. And so we celebrate all that, and we recognize how much of what we call jazz comes from Cuba, and how important it is, leaving the word jazz out for the moment, to think about the sense of lineage that Cuba represents. Tonight, we'll have a very brief conversation, just a hello from our composer, and then a concert, which he'll talk to you about in just a moment. And then after the concert, please stick around to buy the CD, I'm reminded to tell you. And also, stick around, please, to hear a conversation between a wonderful journalist, Larry Blumenfeld, who's been talking with Yosvany Terry for some years. So stick around after the concert for some good talk. But for the moment, I'd like you to help me welcome the multi-instrumentalist and the composer from Cuba, Mr. Yosvany Terry. I would say I'm proud just to stand here next to this man, and my job is just to kind of help him open the door for the concert tonight. When we were talking just a few minutes ago, you were saying, yes, you like the idea that the fact that the music requires you to work hard in a way that very often people don't know. Is part of it. And if you'll permit me, I'll read something that you wrote recently, and then I'll be quiet. This is Yosvany's statement about his own purpose and training as an artist. He says, "It was a foregone conclusion that I would become a musician in the family that he grew up on. And so my parents engaged a teacher, and I began learning to play the violin at age 5. When I was old enough, they sent me to the conservatory. In the conservatory, the teachers were from Russia and the then Eastern Bloc countries, and we studied the Western classical canon exclusively. Monday through Friday, I studied Western classical music, and on the weekends, I continued to learn Cuban popular music." And then he goes on to say, "I discovered jazz at 13 in my musical household in Cuba, when my brother brought home a cassette tape of Chick Corea's record, Friends. And ever since, I've been obsessed with the genre. There was no such thing as jazz in the conservatory, where I was already studying. not even a whisper from our teachers that this American form existed. I began to find out everything I could about it, about jazz. I traveled to the National Library to see what I could learn, and then discovered 2 radio stations and on, like that. We might start by asking you to say just a word more about your training and how you happen to make it from there to here.
Do you hear me? Yes. Hello, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. I believe the journey has been long, and it's been a journey that has gone through many rigorous paths, starting from my family, as I explained in the article, and I consider myself fortunate to come from a family that they're considered cultural bearers of the Afro-Cuban musical traditions from both sides of my family, and but that was something that we could never speak about with friends, and then having the incredible role model of my father and both my mother and my father being a musician and being the major inspiration for us to follow, and this inspiration help us continue the journey through the conservatories and master the European musical tradition, but at the same time, thanks to my father and his orchestra, to really deepen my knowledge on the Cuban musical traditions, which I've always admired so much. So finding jazz was something that really opened up many doors, because it was a way to embrace freedom, and embrace freedom not in a sense of finding not only new ways, but also to embrace freedom that also helped me to embrace my own culture with freedom. And it was also to understand my identity, where I was coming from, my past, and everything that I wanted to break away from. And I believe that the work that you will listen tonight is part of that. It's part of that journey that I believe I will be in that journey for the rest of my life. And it is also the reflection on so many encounters with traditions, with music, with characters from where I come from, with characters from Harlem, and with characters from different parts of the world.
Okay. You've let us know that you're going to be talking about African dimensions in your music and about travel. Could we start by asking what should we listen for as we listen for these 2 elements, for Afro and travel?
Yeah. First, it's good to know that the musicians that you will listen to tonight, they are musicians that they're not only they're masters of their instrument, but at the same time, for example, Yosvany, the piano player who is from Santa Clara, Cuba, Junior, the bass player, who's from Camagüey, and also happens to be my brother. Ludwig Afonso on drums also comes from Cuba, but he grew up since early age here in the States. And the only one that we haven't given yet the Cuban passport is Alex Sipiagin, that he's from Russia. But interestingly enough, there's like so many things that we share, because from cartoons, melodies, and different things going to school. But the music that you will listen tonight, for me, it represents going in a journey of musical traditions, going in a journey of musical genres, of course. I think it represents the influences that I've had so far, or up until this moment. My journey through the music conservatories in Havana and Camagüey, my province. The journey also of the musical traditions that have been preserved from my family, coming from my mother's side, all of the vaudou that her family that emigrated from Haiti brought, and then from my father, his families come from Jamaica and Spain, but they were cultural bearers of the Lukumi musical tradition that came all the way from Nigeria, and especially from the Yoruba kingdom. So yes, you will hear a lot of that, but you will hear the sound of New York, because we all have been living in New York, and I've been living in New York here for the past 18 years, and it is impossible to escape to the aesthetics that we grew up and that we are experiencing in New York all the time. The sound of the city, the texture that the city have, and how this makes an imprint on everything that I do.
You're also a professor at Harvard University, and maybe our last question before we bring your colleagues on might be: is there a teaching element to what would you be teaching us tonight if you were to spell out what the message is you hope we leave with?
That's a hard one.
Too hard for the Harvard man, I think.
Well, I think what I always expect from the concerts, first of all, is to communicate to the audience and helping them to open up to even experiences that they haven't been part of previously. Sometimes introduce some of them to my past, to my present, and even the stuff that are really now boiling in what I consider my lab, which is my home. But I also I'm also hope that the audience they go away with the sound of the diaspora, the sound of the different musical traditions and everything that I've learned up until now, and that this helped them not only to become more open to everything that is happening now, and especially within this generation and from previous generation that were my source of inspiration, but also that helped them to be open, to embrace the world in a different way, and to help them understand that the world is bigger than sometimes what we just know.
And it's time for me to make my departure and ask you to bring the band on. But thanks for being here and for having this word with me to start with.
Thank you so much for inviting us here to be part of the Jazz Studies. It is my pleasure to introduce to Mr. Yosvany Paredes on piano, Junior Terry on bass, Ludwig Afonso on drums, and Alex Zipiagin on trumpet.
once again. It's a pleasure to be working with these musicians who I admire the most, and I consider them to be, at the top of the world at this moment. The music that you're listening to tonight, as I was speaking to Professor Millie, represents different stages of the band and different moments and records that we have recorded. We started the concert with Looking in Retrospect, and we continued with Harlem Matinee. They're both compositions from an older CD that is named Today's Opinion, and was also selected by the New York Times among the 10 best CD of the year. The music specifically, this music deals with, I would say, like a numerology system that I created to compose and create the material for this CD. And in it you can listen to a lot of things coming from different parts, especially from Cuba, but also the sound of New York, especially the second one that's entitled Harlem Matinee, and supposed to capture the entire dynamic that it's in Harlem every day of the year. The painting of their characters, the multiculturalism of the neighborhood, and the energy and the synergy that you experience once you wake up and you go through the streets of Harlem. We're going to continue with another composition entitled Winds of Sorrow, which was written by Junior Terry, my brother on bass. How are we doing out there? The next composition that we're playing, well, first of all, that was such a beautiful ballad. Let's give it a one more time for Junior Terry. I asked him to explain what the ballad was about, but he said, no. Let people take it home. I said, okay. The next composition that we're playing is entitled New Throne King, and it's the composition that gave the title to one of the CDs that I put out 2 years ago, and also was nominated for the Grammys. This CD was actually the journey through the research that I did for 7 years, inspired on the Arara tradition that still prevails in Cuba, especially Matanzas. And the center of the research was at the Cabildos Sabalú. Cabildos are mutual aid societies that are still, that you can still find them in Cuba. They were founded by people, people that, the first Africans, especially that came from West Africa. And in this case, the Arara tradition came from the kingdom of Dahomey. So this was an illuminating journey for me. It was the opportunity that I have to meet who later became my godfather, and also one that was the latest initiated drummers within this musical tradition. His name was known as Mario Rodriguez. He just passed like 3 years ago. So this journey, it was not only to learn about the culture, but then building the drums, which we don't have here today. And then it was important for me to have this music performed with a dancer, since the dancer is one of the best ways that people can see all this energy and knowledge channel through the body of a dancer. So this particular composition is entitled New Throne King, and it's inspired of one of the Pataki from which means one of the stories of Asohano, which is one of the most important deities for the Arara people. And I don't want to turn this into a lecture about that, but I will let the music speak for itself. Kultura ya Kumba, sapalu ndio watu kwa mimi. Kututole, sapalu ndio. Sapalu ndio nao, sapalu ndio. Intapa pia na mimi oboduka kwa dini mama. Ina maya yeye ya Kumba ina lumeni. Emi sapalu awanyatole. Emi sapalu bobo kudugoma na yusoro kwa mtano. Emi sapalu hanyanya. Emisa paludo es cambio. Emisa paludo sobreviviente. Emisa paludo no agua. Emisa paludo que no te ni. Emisa paludo así de Oscar. Emisa paludo yo estoy diciendo lo que me ha dado. Emisa paludo yo amo. Aprecio lo que hace. Una mano ya está, una mano yo tú, una mano a otro. One more time, Yosvany Paredes on piano. Unitary on bass. Loading Afonso on drums. It's Alex Piang on trumpet. I want to thank Professor Amili, and the jazz studies here in Colombia, and maybe we have a chance to play one more. And it's a pleasure also to be here and to perform for the community here, the Colombia community, the Harlem community, and New York at large. And this composition is entitled Nuevo Jazz Latino. Yosvany Paredes. Libertarian Bass. Loving Alfonso Ron. Alex Diego trumpet. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a minute and bring Professor Amelia and Larry.
Once again, for the Yosvany Terry Quintet. Thank you so much. Our goal in a situation like this is to give you more than you came for, and you've already gotten that because we went all the way from the most holy night, up to the rumba. So it's been wonderful. By the time you took the shikare out there, it was over. Just so beautiful. We're going to take just a moment to breathe, and people who have to leave now would be your moment to go. We're going to have the great good fortune of having, I think, the best writer, aside from Yosvany himself, writing about Yosvany Terry, Larry Blumenfeld, come out and help us work with Yosvany Terry to hear the music anew. So let's take a moment and stretch your legs. We'll start in 2 or 3 minutes. Let's.
Should you stay or go? For those of you who want to stay, we're going to talk a little bit. Good evening. My name's Larry Blumenfeld. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. What better place for a Jewish guy from Brooklyn to be on the first night of Passover than uptown on a stage talking to a Cuban musician? But, we have normally I would be involved in this long dinner ritual where at a certain point we ask a series of questions. And then one of those questions is, why is this night different than all others? And tonight it's because Yosvany Terry made music. And so I get to do that ritual of asking questions. I want to say a couple of words first about, first of all, just being here and being grateful to the Center for Jazz Studies. I had the luxury of doing a fellowship little down the road at the journalism school almost 20 years ago. And I thought I'd get away from jazz, but instead I hung out at the Center for Jazz Studies, which to me is one of the first places to truly recognize in our academic world the centrality of whatever we'd call jazz culture and how it has roots and resonances in the humanities, in literature and the arts and the humanities. And I say that also because that's something that I've always felt about your approach to your music, that larger consciousness. Also, I'm glad Bob O'Mealy mentioned that idea that, maybe the United States doesn't have complete proprietary ownership of everything, and that whatever we talk about when we talk about jazz has to do with a lot of history in this hemisphere. And I can add to that from my point of view. If you do what I do, which part of what I do is cover what's best about jazz or creative music or improvisation in New York, I can't not write about Yosvany Terry. I can't not write about the primacy of Cuban musicians in New York and Afro-Cuban ideas. And there's a big history there, but there's also simply the reality that the best and hippest stuff will naturally involve the conversation between Cuban musicians and musicians from the United States. So Bob O'Meally, being the great scholar that he is, beat me to the very citation. But there's this wonderful piece in Revista, the Harvard Review of Latin America, which is put out by the University Harvard, where Yosvany teaches now. And first of all, its title is Afro Roots and Mozart Too. So I recommend that you look it up. So yeah, I'll repeat, I'll pull out just the language you're using. You started to fall in love with jazz. There was no such thing as jazz in the conservatory where I was already studying. Not even a whisper from our teachers that this American form existed. So yeah, let's tease out a little bit how these elements, jazz, Afro-Cuban folkloric tradition, and classical music entered your life, and what separated them and what connected them. Like how did those three elements enter your life?
Yeah, well, that's a difficult question, because I believe they all enter my life at different times. Of course, the Afro-Cuban musical tradition came to me. I mean, even from family. Even before I didn't even know how to speak, I was already going to the ceremonies that were happening within my family, both sides of my family. As I said, from my mother's side, we're all coming from Haiti, and they brought with them all their voodoos, their voodoo, and their voodoos basically, and they were practitioners and devotees. My grandmother was the singer of the temple, and then from my father's side, it was more of my aunt. It was my father's aunt who was the priest of the province of Camagüey, and he was a devotee of Elegua. So through him, it was how my father learned the shekere and then passed these traditions to all my brothers and myself. And then my father, at the same time, is a classical violinist that he trained in the classical music school, and he was also the founder of one of the most important charanga orchestras in Cuba and in the interior, Maravillas de Florida. So for us, growing up at home, music was not even a choice. Right. It was forgone that we were going to become a musician, and at early age, we started studying the violin. That was my first instrument.
When did you move to saxophone?
I moved to saxophone when I was 9 years old. But what is interesting is to understand that we were learning all of this musical tradition. I was learning all of this musical tradition, but you never question what it is that you're learning. You're just learning something that's important for you. You're learning traditions, both from different parts of West Africa. You're learning classical music, you're learning Cuban music, popular Cuban music, and it was never a question of that there was any division among them. All of them were equally important.
That was my question. For you, even as a child, as a young student, these were pieces of one whole. But jazz was removed from that? Jazz was underground?
Jazz wasn't in the picture, I must admit. Jazz wasn't in the picture, and I didn't discover jazz until later, when I started going to the music conservatories, and my brother brought a tape back home. So that's how I heard that recording from Chick Corea. It was his record Friends. And what was interesting to me is yes, I listened to the music, I understood a lot of things, but then they would go into this area of freedom that I just didn't know what it was, to later discover that was improvisation. So was one of the things that fascinated me the most, and that was the beginning of the journey of searching what jazz was.
Now, when you're older at the conservatory, the first jazz group that you organized, started recording with, was Columna Bay?
It was Columna Bay.
Which all the members have gone on to some renown. But what were you trying to do at that moment? Or what did you think you were doing at that moment, musically?
Well, there have been seminal groups in Cuba that have been inspirations for me. Among them, Emiliano Salvador, Chucho Valdez and Iraqueres, Opus Treces, and this group, what fascinated me from them is like they were jazz musicians, but they were also working with all of different elements of the Cuban popular music from some of the West African musical tradition alive in Cuba, but they were doing something that was unique, and for me that was the most important thing. It was how to use my culture, to use the jazz language as a vehicle to communicate what I really wanted to do. And Columna B was a laboratory for us. Living in Cuba, being graduated from the school, we could spend time to rehearse and polish our craft. So we would rehearse from 11 in the morning until 5. I mean, we didn't have to pay rent, we didn't have to pay phone, we didn't have to pay for anything like that. So only when you can have such a level of dedication and devotion to what you do, you can grow and take music into different realms that you haven't been there before, but that you discover. So working in an ensemble was really important because we were we were learning from each other, we were learning from each other influences, and we were trying to do something new. We didn't have a name, and I've never had a name for what I do, but we were interested in music. The four of us were the product of the music conservatories in Cuba, but also we have different family influences musically. So everybody was bringing something very special to the band.
Yeah, I remember talking to you in Cuba and you getting into this idea about how you were able to work and think about yourself as an artist, which there's a long conversation we could have, which we don't have time for, about the political reality and what opportunities are available or not to someone. But just without even getting into that, at that moment in time in Cuba, what did it mean to you to be an artist versus how maybe a man of the same age would be thinking here?
Well, for me and all of our friends, I think we were the part of a generation that we took music and art very seriously. So for us to live and experience art was something personal. You had to go to all of the plays, you have to go to all of the contemporary dance, ballet, you have to go to the opera, you have to go to the music concert, but you have to do the research, which for me was really fascinating. I was already in my family of learning from the Lukumi tradition coming from Nigeria, and especially from the Yoruba kingdom, the traditions coming from my mother's side. Then having Cuban is a wealth of different of so many different musical traditions. The Congolese musical tradition that was birth that I've been always fascinated. The arara, the
in Camagüey, where you grew up, the primary tradition that you
the primary tradition of Camagüey is there's a big legacy of güiros and bembes. Bembes with the bembe drums, which for people that have never seen bembe drums, so they're more similar to the conga, but not really, because they have tuning pegs on the side, and they're played with the sticks and the hands, especially the one playing la caja, which is the one that is the lead of the ensemble. But then you have a lot of chequeres and güiros. We don't have batas in Camagüey. That was something that arrived much later.
These are the three-headed, of the two-headed drums, group of three drums. Yeah.
Which are the sacred drum from the Yoruba kingdom. We don't have, there was also, a Congolese legacy to there. But there was at the same time punto cubano, which is a tradition that is coming more out of the Spanish legacy, especially from the south, that was mixed with some of the mixed also from different traditions from the West African, and I've been even learning more to understand how, I don't want to be so specific because that can lose a lot of people, how not only the patterns, belt patterns, were coming from specific regions, and then listening to some of the group that came from Dahomey, like the Ohun de Gara and the Cabildo Sabalu also, you can see how the same bell pattern got into what we call música guajira or música campesina in Cuba. No one's talk about it. No one really identifies where those patterns are coming from because now they're so strong and they're just part of one thing. And also, especially because, musicologists have always, in Cuba, trying to defend that as something pure that came from Spain, which I believe that it just has so many other influences that didn't exist in Spain. But yes, I mean, you grow up in that melange of things.
And one thing I've always appreciated about your music is all these very specific elements, deeply researched elements are in there. It's deeply researched music, but it doesn't sound that way. I want to jump a little bit to, once you came here, or maybe even before you came here, you had a powerful connection with a musician I consider very influential, Steve Coleman, another alto saxophonist. Now, when I talked to you about your experiences with Steve, I thought that you'd talk more about Charlie Parker and his influence, or numerology and metric systems in music, which you did talk a little bit about, but more what you talked about was that Steve inspired you to continue to look back, or to look back newly into your own culture and rethink spirituality in the context of African tradition. So what did that stimulate for you? How did that search take shape after you worked with Steve?
Well, Steve Coleman is a musician that is very, very serious about music, very serious about the jazz musical tradition from here and the other American musical traditions coming out of the African American experience. So by him coming to Cuba, and he was interested to work with Afro Cuba de Matanza, one of the greatest folkloric group coming out of the province of Matanza. For me, that was really special because I've been always interested in my own culture, but to see him that he came to work with these musicians and learn and find out ways to integrate it with his research, it was really inspiring. It was inspiring to the point that it made me think, okay, well, yes, I've been always interested in learning on my own, but I need to make this as something with more discipline, something that I can just go every year and go into the countryside, do my field research, and see how I can advance this in my music and how I can also grow deeper foundation for my music. So that was important, but it's important to say for me, as I recognize all the time, that Steve and myself, I consider myself part of a community, and without that community, things are not possible. So for me, it was really important to have community members here in New York, from which I've learned so much, and I have the opportunity to collaborate, like Pedro Martinez, Daphne Prieto. I mean, it's important to say because we are not the result of an isolated, I would say, phenomenon, but it's a community phenomenon. Right. And the fact that there have been so many cultural bearers moving to New York, like Pedro, Roman, Marvin, Mauricio, yes, like Daphne Prieto, Junior, Osmani Paredes, Manuel Valera, David Vireles, now Roman Filiu. These help us not only to focus, but also to learn from each other and to push the type of work that we're doing to a deeper level.
So I should make clear to people who are here that if you don't know Yosvany Terry's music, as brilliant as what you heard tonight is, it's one strand. So another strand, when we talk about borders, another imaginary border that exists is between jazz, classical, chamber music. So what was the impulse behind Bohemian Trio, which is you on saxophone, piano, and cello? What was the impulse to do that, and what do you think you're achieving there?
Well, Bohemian Trio was trying to find a way to continue all the training and education that I have in classical music and contemporary music in Cuba, and also here in New York, because once I moved, then I went all the way to manage to take orchestration, composition, counterpoint, and all of that, and to keep growing as a composer. So this was a unique opportunity for me to channel all of this questioning. So yes, I love classical music, and I like to write more in a long form of composition musical tradition. So with Bohemian Trio, which is a chamber music, the idea was to have that platform to develop that, but at the same time, for me, to bring improvisation back into the chamber music circuit. And especially because...
Which is restoring a little bit of the original idea, right?
Exactly. All of the great composers like Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, Bartok, they were improvisers. So this tradition got lost in classical music as the importance was played more in the role of the interpreters rather than the composers being the one going out on tour. So yes, Bohemian Trio, we just developed a complete different repertoire. It's an unusual group and instrumentation because it's cello, as you said, piano and saxophone, and sometimes it sounds like a trio, sometimes it sounds like an orchestra, and
very much so, yeah.
That's the idea of it. It's like find the challenge of composer and orchestrator on how to play with the sounds of the trio.
It's funny because you talk about that idea of bringing improvisation back into that consciousness, but there's the other thing where we don't, or haven't until recently, thought of jazz musicians or certain Cuban musicians as composers. Maybe they were improvisers or great players, but now we can recognize Thelonious Monk or someone else as a truly great composer. But do you feel like, you as a composer, that if you're a good enough composer, can those distinctions, genres, styles just fade away by the strength of your composition?
I do believe so, and especially because I don't like to see music as separate language and vocabularies. I love music, and the result of what I compose will be the result of all my experiences without having to make a difference of what it is we're doing here. Are we using a specific language to recreate this? So recreation is something different. Once you believe in music as a whole, then you can just believe in music.
Now, each of the things we've talked about here beg much, much more conversation. And we're not going to be able to go that deeply into it. But before we go, you teach at Harvard. I wish I could be your student at Harvard. Now, if I were in your class at Harvard now, this semester, what would I be learning about Cuban music?
Well, I'm
a little bit about that curriculum.
I'm teaching a course now at the school, which is called Contrapunteo Cubano, and it's a Cuban counterpoint through the lens of this composer. And it's a study of Cuban music from the 1800s to the 1950s through the lens of 6 selected composers, including Miguel Failde, who's the creator of a danzón, Ernesto Lecuona, one of the most prolific composers from Cuba that exposed Cuban music to the international arena, Cindo Garay, an enormous creator from the Vieja Trova Santiaguera, Arsenio Rodriguez, who also lived in New York, and he's been one of the pillars of the song tradition, and not only in Cuba, but here also in New York. Enrique Jorrin, who's the creator and inventor of the cha-cha-cha, a rhythm that put the entire world to dance, and Bebo Valdez. So at this course, not only we analyze their musical contributions, we look at their score, but we also study them within the social and historical context to really understand what was happening, the entire world, what was happening in Cuba, the influences that they were receiving, and to understand also their musical generations.
And when you talk about that context that way, I'll just, by way of beginning to wrap it up, I'll tell you two of the subheadings of Yosvany's piece in the Harvard Review. My creative process is not random. My teaching reflects an attention to context. And I feel like, that comes across very strongly in your music. I want to thank Babo Mili and Yolanda and everyone here at the Center for Jazz Studies, and thank you for staying. It's a privilege to be here, and it's always, it's hard to track Yosvany Terry down sometimes. It takes many texts, many calls, but I get him sitting here and he can't leave.
We managed to.
It's so good to be able to speak with you.
It's a pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you for staying.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, senor.